So we've covered the first two laws of nature, and the way I've been trying to explain them are that they are these rules that we might be able to discover or think up if we're given a kind of moment of reflection in the state of nature. And the second law of nature kind of is a progression from or follows upon the first one. Seek peace. Okay, yeah, that'd be great, but no one's going to trust me, and because everyone's just going to think, even if I go say I'm seeking peace, everyone's just going to think that I'm trying to take their stuff. Well, okay, so to try to solve that problem, maybe we should lay down our rights to I'll lay down my right to your stuff, lay down your right to my stuff, and maybe that that will help avoid a state of war, right? And that's the second law of nature. But we saw that that doesn't quite work. And so I think the way to understand the third law of nature, or one way to approach it, is to think of it as like a kind of further progression. And the problem we ran into when we were considering the second law of nature, I might say that I'm going to lay down my right, and you might say that you're going to lay down your right, but I don't know, then we don't, right? Out of this kind of suspicion or whatever. And so the third law of nature is going to be something like, when you say you're going to lay down your right, actually do it. Right? Something like that is what the third law of nature states. But to get there and to see how it states that, and to see how it would be a kind of progression from these first two laws of nature, we're going to need to do a little bit of background, because the third law of nature, the way Hobbes puts it, perform your covenants. And the background that we're going to need is, what on earth does he mean by covenant? He means something very specific. It's a technical term for Hobbes. And in the readings, he describes in detail what exactly he means by a covenant. Now, before we get to those details, however, right? So that's the third law of nature. This is a general rule discoverable by reason, which is aimed at our self-preservation. It's aimed at our self-preservation in as much as it's a kind of it's a way to stop this war, this state of war. Now you might think, well, okay, fine, whatever. I don't know. Who really cares? I don't know. This is the law of justice according to Hobbes. This is maybe the most important of the laws of nature. This is what justice consists in. According to Hobbes, justice consists in performing your covenants, and injustice is nothing other than breaking a covenant. We're going to return to this in a second, right? So this is a kind of important one. This is where justice first comes onto the scene for Hobbes. Okay, well, what exactly is a covenant? To understand what a covenant is, we first need to understand what a contract is. And you might think, well, contract, that's a little bit easier to understand. We use that word all the time. That's no big deal. Well, Hobbes has a technical notion of contract. He means something very specific by a contract. A contract is a mutual transferring of a right. So in the simplest case, and this doesn't really cover what exactly we would mean by contract. When we talk about a contract, we're talking about something you write up and we agree to do things and we sign it, and then I agree to do it. What we mean by a contract is actually more like a covenant in Hobbes's sense. So the contract in Hobbes's sense is a mutual transferring of a right. So this would be something that happens when we exchange. Right. So let's say, I've got my lawnmower and you've got your $40. I don't know. And we exchange them. I push the lawnmower over to you. You hand the $40 over to me. Well, we've transferred rights. We've engaged in a mutual transferring of a right. I have transferred my right to my lawnmower to you, and you have transferred your right to your $40 to me. Now, after this exchange, I have a right to the $40, and I no longer have a right to the lawnmower. And after the exchange, you have a right to the lawnmower. You no longer have a right to the $40. Whereas prior to the exchange is the exact opposite, right? Prior to the exchange, you had no right to the lawnmower. You had a right to the $40, and so on for me. And so that's an example of what Hobbes would call it contract. It's a kind of mutual transferring of a right. It's not necessarily a written up sheet of paper. There are no promises in the sense of like, well, you do this later for me, which when we use the notion of contract, there typically would be. Now, a covenant is a contract in which one party is to fulfill their end later, at some later time, in the meantime, being trusted to do so. This is really kind of more of what we mean by a contract. Hobbes would call it a covenant. So, for example, this is not in fact how it works, but let's say it worked this way just for the sake of illustration. Let's say, so I've got a contract with Loyola, and let's say the way it worked, and this is not how it works, let's say the way it worked was they said, okay, you come and teach classes, you teach your classes, whatever, we'll give you your courses that we want you to teach. And I say, okay, fine. And we'll give you money. Here's all the money. Let's say they gave it to me in just one lump sum at the beginning of the year. Doesn't work like that. Yeah, I mean, it kind of works like that. They give it to me in lump sums periodically throughout the year. I mean, that just makes the example a little bit more muddied. So let's say they just gave it to me in a lump sum at the beginning of the year. They could do that. That'd be fine. That would be a covenant in Hobbes' sense. Because what's happened there, if they did it that way, Loyola had a right to the money that they were going to pay me with, right? And I had a right to my time to do with it as I see fit. And what we do in this agreement is Loyola lays down their right to that money, and they transfer that right to me, right? And they shoot that money into my bank account or whatever. And now I have a right to it. And if they paid me in one lump sum at the beginning, the way that'd be working, right? They transfer that right to me, and then they would trust me to fulfill my end later. That is to say, when the semester comes around and it's time to teach class and do whatever I need, whatever it is it's required of me, they would trust me to do that, to sacrifice my right to my time and give it over to Loyola, essentially doing what they've asked me to do, right? Preparing class materials, teaching classes, and so on, right? So I transfer a right to my free time to Loyola. Right? And they trust me to do that. That's a covenant, right? You trust someone to fulfill their end later. And so the third law of nature tells us it's a general rule discoverable by reason, which directs us to perform our covenants. When you enter into a covenant, perform your end of it. If you have been trusted to perform your end of it later, perform it later, is essentially what the third law of nature is saying. And so when I come, so let's say we're in this state of nature, and well, before we get to the state of nature, actually what I want to say, this is what justice amounts to, according to Hobbes, right? We'll get to the state of nature stuff in just a second. This is what justice is. Justice consists in basically keeping your promises, more or less. It consists in performing your covenants. If you have engaged in this mutual transferring of a right and you have agreed to perform your end later, say, performing your end later is what it is to act justly. And injustice is nothing other than breaking a covenant. That's all that injustice is, according to Hobbes. And so if you have entered into a covenant and someone is laid, so for example, to take the example I was talking about earlier with Loyola paying me in one lump sum, if Loyola transfers me that money, yeah, and there it is in my bank account, all, $10,000, no, they pay me more than that, but not that much more. And then I don't show up to class, right? I don't prepare anything. You guys, whatever, come to, there's just nothing there. Well, I would have broken my covenant. That would be unjust. I have just acted unjustly, right? If I received the money and then didn't perform my end of the deal, that would be injustice. That's a paradigmatic case of injustice, according to Hobbes. Injustice is nothing other than the breaking of a covenant. Okay. So how does this relate to this stuff about the state of nature? Well, think of it like this. Where we kind of left, I'm not going to animate you stabbing me with the spear again, right? It's traumatic enough as it is. I can't stand watching it one more time. But where we left off, when we were considering me and you in the state of nature and these laws of nature, we left off with me saying, hey, look, I'm going to lay down my rights. And you're saying, yeah, I'd like to lay down my rights too, but I don't trust you. I don't know about that. Well, now the third law of nature says something like, the problem there is that these people, me and you, we weren't performing our covenants. We were kind of maybe seeking to lay down our rights, but then we didn't really do it. And so the third law of nature is saying, well, look, if you really want peace, if you really want to get out of this state of war, you guys got to perform your covenants. Yeah, that's what the third law of nature is saying. When you lay down your rights, you've got to do it. You have to actually do it and honor that laying down of rights, that transferring of rights. But again, just like with the first two laws of nature, there's a problem. People in a state of nature are not going to follow this. Now, the reason they're not going to follow it is a little bit different. The reason they're not going to follow this law of nature is because it would be impossible to, according to Hobbes. It's not just because I'm really fearful and I really want the apple or anything. You won't be able to perform this. Why? Because there are no covenants in a state of nature. Hobbes is very clear about this. In the state of nature, all covenants are invalid, which is just to say it's impossible to enter into a covenant in a state of nature. There are no covenants in a state of nature. They're invalid. Well, why? Why is that? His idea, as soon as one party to the covenant, so me and you, we're the two parties to the covenant, say, I'm going to lay down my right, you're going to lay down your right, right? That's the idea. I lay down my right to, so in the example we were considering in the previous video, you had an apple and I come along. Now I'm going to say, I'm going to lay down my right to your apple. And you say, okay, that's great. And I transfer that right over to you. Now, my right to your apple, right? Because I have a right to your apple by the right of nature. I transfer my right to your apple. In addition, I transfer my right to rearrange your body parts as I see fit. I transfer my rights to do those things over to you. Yeah, that's how my end of the covenant would work. And then you would then be expected to transfer your right to rearrange my body parts and your right to my resources, right? So if in the future I stumble across, a coconut or whatever, right? If we're entering into this covenant, the idea would be you're transferring your right to my coconut now over to me, to the coconut to me, right? So if I come across some food, some resources, the coconut in the future, you no longer claim a right to it. Right? That's how this covenant is working. I'm going to trust you to lay down your right to my resources when I acquire them. Yeah. So I'm trusting you in the meantime. So that's a covenant. Now, why is that invalid? Because as soon as one party to the covenant, it doesn't matter which one, right, has a reasonable suspicion that the other party won't fulfill their end, the covenant is invalid. So as soon as I have a reasonable suspicion, right? So it's not just any old crazy suspicion, but a reasonable suspicion that you're not going to live up to your end of the bargain, that you're not going to do it. Covenant's invalid. It's no longer binding. Well, okay. Well, why does that mean, maybe we both look really trustworthy or whatever? No, Hobbes, why does that mean that all covenants in the state of nature are invalid? Hobbes claims that in a state of nature, it's reasonable to suspect that right away, it's reasonable to suspect that the other party won't fulfill their end of the covenant, right? With even just the littlest, think of it like this. We meet in the state of nature. We agree. I say, I'll lay down my right to your resources, both the ones you have now and whatever you acquire in the future. And you agree to lay down your right to my resources, the ones that I have, both the ones I have now and the ones I acquire in the future. You say, okay, that's great. That's a covenant. as soon as one of us reasonably suspects that the other won't fulfill their end of the bargain, the covenant's invalid. And there's going to be reasonable suspicion of that right away, as soon as the words are done leaving our mouths, according to Hobbes, because we're still in a state of nature. We still have these resources are still scarce. Our primary motivation is fear of death. And so there's a reasonable suspicion right away that the other party to the contract is just trying to dupe me to get my stuff. And as soon as I turn my back, they're going to, slam a spear into it and take my apple or whatever. Yeah. Right away, there's a reasonable suspicion. And Hobbes' idea is that it'd be reasonable to act that way in a state of nature. That's why it's a reasonable suspicion. That would be a reasonable thing to do in a state of nature, according to Hobbes, where you are staving off starvation, where, any little resource is going to be incredibly valuable for your self-preservation. It might be reasonable to act in this way, to make these kind of lying promises and stab people in the back and so on. And so in the state of nature, it's going to be reasonable to suspect right away that the other party is not going to fulfill his or her end of the covenant. And that means every covenant made in the state of nature is invalid, which is just to say there are no covenants in a state of nature. Now, one very interesting and important implication of this idea: there is no justice or injustice in the state of nature. And when I say there is no justice in the state of nature, what I mean by that is not the way that we would use that phrase. So we would say there's no justice in, whatever, I don't know, our tax scheme or tax brackets, or just there's no justice in the criminal justice system, right? Innocent people get sent to jail and guilty people go free. There's no justice there. That's not what Hobbes means here. He does, because those are when we use that phrase, there's no justice here, we're saying there's like injustice. Hobbes would say there's no injustice in a state of nature either. And so what he means when he says that there's no justice in the state of nature is that it's not possible to act justly. There's no action you could perform that would count as an act of doing something just. It's not possible to act justly. It's also not possible to act unjustly in a state of nature. And that's perhaps the more radical claim. But they kind of go together. It's for the very same reason. It's not possible to act justly. It's not possible to act unjustly. Why? Because there are no covenants. And to act justly is simply to keep your covenants. And to act unjustly is simply to break them. And so if you don't have any covenants, you can't keep them, you can't break them, which means you can't act unjustly, or you can't act justly, you can't act unjustly. There's just no way to. There is no justice or injustice. They don't apply in the state of nature. You might think, well, I don't know. I mean, okay, fine. Maybe you can't have these like contracts that you draw up or whatever. And I don't know. Okay, fine. But I don't know. Isn't it unjust to just, stick a spear in a guy's face or whatever? Isn't that unjust still in a state of nature? Hobbes would say, no, that's not unjust in a state of nature. It is once we leave the state of nature, according to Hobbes, and we'll talk about that. But in a state of nature, that is not unjust. Why? Because by the right of nature, you have a right to do that. In a state of nature, you have the right to rearrange someone's face as you see fit, if it's deemed needful for self-preservation. And so things such as killing other people, not unjust. You taking my apple or me taking your apple or whatever it might be in a state of nature, not unjust. And you can even, I'm not really even taking your apple. It's not yours. Certainly not exclusively yours. It's just as much mine as it is yours, because we equally have rights to it. By the right of nature that we both equally have, We have equal claims to that apple. And so Hobbes would want to say stealing isn't really even possible. I mean, stealing almost contains within it the idea that I'm taking something that's yours. And yeah, I guess technically that happens. You have a right to the apple, but I have just as much right to it. And so if I'm just taking something that I have a right to, I mean, is that really, I don't know. The point would be, it's not unjust, right? You went and collected all these apples and you're eating them. I can just come up and take them from you. There's nothing unjust about that, Hobbes would say. He's not reveling in this. He doesn't think this is great. You can do whatever you want. He thinks this is horrible. This is the worst state of humanity. We need to avoid this somehow. Nonetheless, the idea is, in a state of nature, there is no justice or injustice.